The last time Russia signed a peace agreement with Ukraine, it used the ceasefire to rearm, regroup, and eventually launch a full-scale invasion. A new piece in Foreign Affairs warns that if Putin agrees to stop fighting today, he's probably not stopping the war. He's just changing how he fights it. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi, and this is In Focus. Tonight, we examine a piece published this week in Foreign Affairs by Malcolm Qnews of the Kennan Institute and Hannah Notte of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. The piece is titled, "Putin Will Turn a Ceasefire into a Weapon." The argument is straightforward and troubling. Russia's political project in Ukraine has failed. After 4 years of brutal war, Putin has not subjugated Ukraine, has not installed a friendly government in Kiev, and has no clear path to military victory. He is in a dead end, but a dead end is not a surrender. The authors argue that if and when Putin agrees to a ceasefire, he will treat it the way he treated the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, not as peace, but as a different kind of war. He will push for elections in Ukraine to sow political chaos, use European pro-Russian voices to normalize the occupation, try to widen the gap between Washington and European allies, and wait for Ukraine's international support to erode once the visible violence stops. The piece also makes a point about Europe that cuts against the usual narrative that, despite Trump's disengagement, Europe has stepped up more than Moscow expected and is now, in the author's words of course, the primary non-Ukrainian obstacle standing in Putin's way. Mr. Nicholas Williams, former senior NATO official, joins us tonight from London. Mr. Nicholas, welcome to In Focus. Now, Mr. Nicholas, the piece opens with the Minsk agreements. Russia signed them, then used the breathing room to build up for 2022. Is that the template that we should expect Putin to use again if a ceasefire happens?
Yes, good evening, Hella, and greetings to your viewers.
Thank you, sir.
This is a problem because the article by these two authors are a mirror image of what the Russians claim to be the flaws of the Minsk agreement and the flaws of the ceasefire. The Russians, Putin, believes that the Ukrainians tricked, particularly in conjunction with Merkel, the German, and the French, used that Minsk agreements to rearm Ukraine and to get out of the obligations that the Ukraine had, not the Russians. The Russians allege that they are not signatories to the Minsk agreements. They were guarantors. And so, as ever in this situation, there are two opposing narratives which cannot be reconciled.
So the authors also say that Putin's political project in Ukraine has, according to them, failed spectacularly. Do you agree? And does a leader who has failed this badly on the battlefield actually want a ceasefire, or does he want to keep the fighting going on?
Yes, I think the authors are correct. And in terms of spectacular failure of political objectives by Putin. In June of 2024, Putin made a speech to the foreign ministry in which he set out the objectives of the special military operation, as he calls it. And those objectives, in my interpretation, were all political. The neutrality of Ukraine, the demilitarization of Ukraine, and the denazification of Ukraine. That means that a regime change to in favor of a government which favors Russian political culture, political uh, friendliness, and also the language and culture. And these were political objectives,
Yes.
and that they have failed because the Ukraine hasn't changed its point of view politically or strategically in terms of joining the West. And so, yes, I agree. But where I don't agree is that Putin is failing on the battlefield. He is slowly, methodically, relentlessly using his forces to gain territory in east of Ukraine. But gaining territory doesn't mean achieving political aims. And that's what his problem is. The gap between territory and achieving political aims is
Yes.
as wide as ever.
Yes. Well, the piece lists Putin's escalation options, mass mobilization, intensified bombing of cities, strikes on European countries, supporting Ukraine. Why hasn't he used any of these more aggressively yet?
That's a debate in Russia. Ironically, from a Western perspective, there is a big debate about Putin being too weak, too cautious, too mild in his pursuit of his military objectives. But why hasn't he? I believe that NATO deterrence is the reason for him not attacking NATO territory. He knows that if NATO territory is attacked with ballistic missiles or with a significant drone attack against a military or civilian target, then the whole alliance would have no option but to mobilize against him. And so he's playing a difficult game. He would like to attack Poland, for example, the logistics hub of the support to Ukraine, but he cannot do so because it will mean not just Poland being attacked, but the whole of NATO, including the United States.
Okay, I see your point. But if Putin does agree to a ceasefire, the piece says that his first move would be to demand elections in Ukraine, then use supervision to create chaos around them. From your own experience at NATO, how realistic is that scenario?
Well, President Putin has always resisted a ceasefire because he believes that it will be the Europeans who will aid the Ukrainians to avoid it and to rearm the Ukrainians. And experience of unregulated ceasefires shows that unless a ceasefire is pinned down, the conditions that are clearly spelled out, the withdrawal of forces along the point of contact, unless a ceasefire is hammered out in terms of the detail of the territory, the front line, the separation of forces, they always fail. And I think Putin knows that. And the Europeans are advocating a ceasefire with the Ukrainians in order to give a rest to very tired and overstretched Ukrainian forces.
Sir, the piece also argues that Putin sees Trump as useful, that a ceasefire framed as Trump's diplomatic victory would widen the gap between Washington and Europe. So is Trump aware that he is being played, or does he not particularly care?
I think he has a suspicion that he's being played. But Putin is very clever to not to overstep the line in playing him. The Anchorage agreement, or at least what the Russians call the spirit of Anchorage, actually was in Russian favor in terms of Ukrainian territorial concessions in return for security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine. And I think the Russians thought that they'd achieved something in Anchorage, but the Americans, I think, rode back on what was an understanding in Alaska because they realized, and Trump realized, that his credibility would be destroyed because he made too many concessions to the Russians.
Well, Mr. Williams, one of the most interesting observations in that piece is that Europe has surprised Moscow. How long can it actually hold?
Yes, I fully agree that I don't think the Russians believed that the European Union or NATO could hold together with the purpose of supporting Ukraine. The Russians, particularly with the energy weapon and the shortage of gas and to Europe, the cutting off of gas to Europe by sanctions, the Russians thought that obviously there would be dissension within, particularly the European Union. But the Russian challenge by invading Ukraine was too much to ignore and too much to squabble about, because it draws into question the whole idea of a peaceful, stable Europe. And the Europeans feel, particularly the EU, but wider Europe as a whole, feel that Russia must not be allowed to win because it will then intimidate and dictate terms to Europe, but particularly to Eastern Europe, which is fearful of Russian revanchism.
Definitely. Well, the piece also says that NATO's Article 5, the collective defense commitment, now has a credibility problem because of Trump's posture. That is a serious thing to say about the alliance's core guarantee. So do you agree with that opinion?
Yes, it does have a credibility problem. The whole idea of Article 5 and what was the policy of deterrence, deterring Russia and before it the Soviet Union, is that the United States, by being present in military terms, in large military terms in Europe, would bear the risks of Europe, and therefore Russia would see that by intimidating, by blackmailing, by even attacking or threatening to attack Europe, it would be Europe. Uh, Now that Trump is pulling significant numbers of troops in Europe, away from Europe, then the Russians can calculate, well, why would the United States come to the defense of Romania, for example, if we initiated a drone attack to intimidate it? So this withdrawal of troops from Europe is inevitably going to call into a question the credibility of Article 5. I agree with that.
Well, Russia has been losing ground in several areas like the South Caucasus, and its promises also in the Sahel are under scrutiny. So, does the ceasefire in Ukraine free up Russian capacity to recover some of that lost influence elsewhere?
It could, but Russia has suffered a huge loss of influence over the past few years. Its ally in Syria has now turned to the West. Its ally in Iran is focused on the Straits of Hormuz. It can't give it substantial uh, political weight. And Ch even China is um, hesitant and distancing itself from the military aspects of Russian claims. And even India, who is a great supporter of Russia, has now again condemned the invasion of Ukraine and seeks to play a mid role between the West and Russia. So, yes, they can gain influence, but their main concern is to win this war in in Ukraine, and that's why the a ceasefire will not happen.
Mhm. The piece mentions that Ukraine's deep strike campaign has brought the war closer to home for Russian citizens. How much does domestic pressure inside Russia actually affect Putin's decision making?
Well, yes, over the past few months, Russian citizens, ordinary Russian citizens, have turned from regarding the Ukraine war as a sideshow into something that affects them fundamentally. There are petrol queues, petrol shortages. There are drone strikes, not only on refineries, but in infrastructure in towns and so on. And so they don't know where a strike will happen next, which is tremendously unsettling for a country which had hitherto regarded itself as invulnerable because their troops, their forces were undefeated in war and so on. And so, yes, they've been unsettled, but to what extent does this affect Putin's mindset? Well, I think it's the opposite to what people would think. There are, as I said before, accusations that Putin is not pursuing this war as strongly, as forcefully as he could. And there is a sort of resentment and a spite, as it were, if you attack us, and particularly the Ukrainian attack on a dormitory, which killed about 24 students last month, many of them girls. That attack has steeled the Russian people to saying the West, don't care about us. why should we care about them?
Sir, the authors write that a ceasefire becomes sustainable only if Putin's fundamental calculus changes, his will to dominate Ukraine. What would actually change that calculus, in your own opinion?
I think what would change that calculus is a combination as what we've seen, economic pressure, but also the a success by the military, Ukrainian military, significant success on the battlefield. And unfortunately, yes, the Ukrainians are in parts holding their own. They have tremendous drone capability. The Russians can't mass in terms of attacks. So that the Ukrainians are holding their own, but it's unrealistic to expect Ukrainian forces to reverse what the Russians have already gained, irrespective of the stories you are hearing or we're hearing in the West. The Ukrainians aren't winning on the battlefield.
Mr. Williams, the piece also warns that European support tends to hold during visible violence, but can dissipate once the shooting stops. Is that a fair reading of how European public opinion works? And is there a way to lock in support structurally before a ceasefire happens?
Well, yes, that's generally how the Europeans work, but below the surface of strong support to Ukraine, there are surprising variations among Europeans. At the NATO summit, for example, I think President Trump used this figure. Only 5 European countries provide 82% of the military support to Ukraine. So there are 30 European countries in NATO, but only 5 of them provide 82% of the support. Yes, others, smaller countries provide limited support, but the burden of supporting Ukraine, European burden, is borne by only 5 countries, Germany, the UK, surprisingly Denmark, a small country, Sweden, and so on.
France as well, I think.
France is not in the top 5.
Okay.
France in military terms. Yes, France is contributing to the EU's financial support of Ukraine, and it's supporting it significantly. But the military support, which you're talking about, which Ukraine will need to demonstrate military progress and success in order to change Putin's calculus, the military support, France is not among the top 5.
I understand. Russia is timing some of its moves around the U.S. midterm elections in November. How much does the American electoral calendar actually shape Putin's tactical decisions?
Yes, obviously he will have an idea, a mind to exploit his. I don't think it's leverage, but exploit his relationship with President Trump before those elections. And Trump, because he's a narcissist, he will want to have a success before those elections. So yes, Putin will exploit and use these midterm elections, but also there are Russian Duma elections, I think in September, and Putin's party has to show some sort of real progress before these elections, because as we said, as we discussed, the Russian population is feeling uneasy and uncertain because this war has already dragged on uh, longer than the Second World War for in the Russian case.
Mhm. Ukraine has been pursuing a deal with Russia. The piece says that is sustainable and requires a genuinely redefined calculus in Russia, which is unlikely while Putin is in power. Is Kiev negotiating towards something achievable or towards something that doesn't even exist yet?
Uh, I believe that Ukraine is not negotiating for something which is achievable because the Russians are adamant and intransigent. They will want, as a minimum, the Donbass and the two uh, oblast regions beyond the Donbass, which they claim is Russian territory now. And so the Russians will not withdraw from those demands, and the Ukrainians will not give up territory that they believe, rightly, is their own.
Mm.
And so I feel that Ukrainian and Russian feelers for negotiations, if such there are, and I doubt it, uh, um, are feeling for a respite, ceasefire, as the article says, um, in order to rearm and recommence the conflict objectives, which are incompatible one with each other.
Mhm, mhm. The piece ends with a direct warning that if the fighting stops, the right response is not to celebrate, but to stay focused on Putin's intent to divide and conquer. What would that look like in practice for NATO and for European governments?
Well, unfortunately, this war has resulted now in a profound division of Europe, with the Russia on the one side and the Europeans on the other, or the rest of the Europeans on the other. And the Russians believe that the Europeans will do their utmost to weaken them, to destroy them, and there'll be a corresponding policy of Russia to weaken the Europeans and the European Union
Mm.
and divide the transatlantic alliance. So we're in a sort of mutually reinforcing security spiral, which each side believes that the other, and I think rightly, has negative and destructive aims towards the other.
Mm.
And we managed to um, survive the Cold War and manage the Cold War relatively civilized.
Mm.
But this Cold War, Cold Freeze, it will be much more difficult to manage.
Mhm. Sir, the piece says that Putin's own elites are starting to argue that Ukraine is just one arena in a broader confrontation with the West and that pouring everything into it is unwise. How much influence do these elites actually have over Putin at this stage of the war?
Well, I think the elites are divided. I think some of the elites may say, well, we should just um, give up on this war, not give up on the territory, but call a halt to this war along the line that we have. We will, from the Russian perspective, gain the Donbass, and
Mm.
then and we keep Ukraine, keep Crimea, and then we should halt. Um, but others will say, well, you, the Europeans and Ukraine will not be happy with a ceasefire arbitrarily and unilaterally declared by Russia, and they will fight against it. So our only option, some of these alternative voices will say, our only option is to continue and continue in terms of weakening Kiev, surrounding Kharkiv, even taking Odessa. So I think the Russians are divided and uncertain about where they're wanting to take this war, but they won't give up territory, but they may uh, declare a arbitrary unilateral ceasefire when they think that they've got a defendable territory uh, to defend in the east of Ukraine.
There is an interesting point I would like to share with you. Now, the authors compare Putin to Stalin and the Tsar and his desire to be seen as a European statesman rather than just aware of it.
Well, there has been in Russia a sort of reevaluation of Stalin um, in terms of his strength, his defense of then Soviet interests and so on. So it's a reevaluation of Stalin as a strong man. But there's no reevaluation of Stalin as a communist ideologue, and I don't think Putin is a hankers after the Soviet Empire or Soviet uh, economic planning. So it's just as a strong man in defense of Russian interests that Stalin is attractive, and a defense of Russian interests against hostile West, which is what the Russians believe that the West is. They believe, as I said, that the West and the Europeans want to carve Russia up into its constituent ethnic parts.
Well, the piece notes that in 2014 and 2015, Russia pushed hard for recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and got nowhere, actually, but succeeded in making Crimea a non-issue for the West over the time. So why did that strategy work for Crimea but not for the Donbass?
That's a good question. I think it didn't work totally for Crimea, but there was a view that Crimea should be handled in terms of isolating Russia and creating costs for Russia. But and there were some voices in the West who said, well, Crimea is understandable as a Russian objective, although they didn't condone its annexation, because it had the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It was part of Russia until 1954, and also the Europeans depended so much on Russian energy that they couldn't envisage firmer, more forceful sanctions or resistance in 2014. But in 2022,
Yes.
those people realized they had made a grave mistake because Russian ambitions weren't just for Crimea.
Yes.
They were for the Russian culture, protection of Russian culture, and
Yes.
ancient Russia as a whole.
Yes. Well, Mr. Nicholas Williams, former NATO official, thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights with us here on Qnews. Thank you so much, sir. The piece we examine tonight is a reminder that in this conflict, the end of fighting and the end of the war are not the same thing. Putin went into Minsk in 2014 not to make peace, but actually to buy time. The authors argue that he would do the same thing again, using the pause to undermine Ukraine politically, widen transatlantic divisions, and also wait for European will to soften once the images of destruction leave the front pages. Whether that scenario plays out depends on whether the lessons of Minsk have actually been learned. Tonight's conversation suggests that they have, at least by the people paying close attention. So whether that is enough is a different question. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of In Focus. Thank you so much for being with us.